But I'm so honored to be here today to share with you about something that I think is really, really near to the heart of God. And because it's near to the heart of God, it's near to the heart of your leadership, it's near to the heart of Canvas. Today I want to talk about something that we'll call remarkable compassion. Okay, and just so we're all on the same page right out the gate, let me tell you what I mean when I say that word compassion. So compassion means, if you break it down, it's real simple. The second part of the word passion means to suffer, and then C-O-M, means with. So to suffer with. That's what compassion means. So compassion really means to stand with or to stand for someone who is suffering. And as I said, that we all know that this is really near to the heart of God, right? Right? Like we know, you open up the scriptures, we know God loves every person on this planet. Every man, woman, and child, right? For God so loved the world, right? That he gave his only son. But if you open up the scriptures, you're going to see from the beginning of the Bible all the way to the end of the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, there are some people that seem to make the top of God's list, right? There are some people that seem to have a special place in God's heart. And we know who they are. Right? It's the orphan, the widow, and the sojourner, or in our term today, the immigrant. The orphan, the widow, and the immigrant. In other words, those who are without a family, those who are without a home, those who have suffered deep loss, so those who are vulnerable. All right, Psalm 82, look here, Psalm 82. It says, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy. This is literally like one of dozens and dozens and dozens of scriptures all throughout the Bible that make it absolutely clear what God's heart is towards those who are vulnerable. Because this has been a defining characteristic of God since the beginning, this has been a defining characteristic of God's people since the beginning. In fact, did you know that the first known hospital in every nation across the globe was started by the Christian movement? Isn't that crazy? If you look at education reform and women's rights, the abolition of slavery, of course, civil rights, they all trace their roots back to the Christian movement. The same is true with adoption. There are written accounts of an old Roman practice, how when a child would be born into a family, the child would sometimes be placed at the feet of its father, and if the father stooped down and picked up the child into his arms, and symbolically, the child was said to have been legitimized into the family. But sometimes the dad didn't stoop down and pick up the child. For whatever reason, maybe the child looked sick or frail, or maybe the child wasn't the preferred gender of the day. Maybe it was just an inconvenient time for the family, but if the father didn't actually stoop down and pick up the child, instead what would happen is that child would be taken outside of the city to a designated place where it would be left alone to die. But it was early followers of Jesus that changed that. It was early followers of Jesus that would reverse that practice. They would go out to these designated places on a regular basis, and they would rescue these children. They would bring them into their own homes. They would raise them up as their own beloved sons and daughters. Isn't that awesome? And it was the early church that put pressure on the Roman government to outlaw the practice. That's our history. That's our legacy as God's people. Isn't that cool? The same is true with foster care. Let me tell you about a guy named Charles Brace. Charles Brace was born in the northeastern part of the U.S. in the 19th century. He grew up in a family that his parents followed Jesus at a young age. Charles placed his faith in Christ as well. And so one day he was sitting in church on a Sunday, just like you guys are today, listening to a message from a pastor, just like you guys are today. And the pastor said something that would just radically change Charles's life, just like I did with you a second ago. I'm just kidding. But the pastor would say something that just pierced his heart. And this, I'm going to paraphrase here, but this is basically what the pastor said. He said, when we think about all that God has done for us, all of the love and the compassion that he has poured out on us so extravagantly in our times of brokenness, in our times of need, it's impossible for us to think that when we see those who are broken around us, that we don't have at least some level of responsibility to do something. When we consider all of the love and the mercy and the grace and the compassion that he has so graciously poured out onto us in our brokenness, when we see those around us who are broken, it's impossible for us to think that we too don't have some level of responsibility to get engaged. And it just pierced his heart. And so a few years would go by, and Charles would be in New York City, and he was going to Bible school. He was going to become a pastor. And he was, when he was in seminary, he decided to take a walk through New York City. And one day, as he was taking this walk, he walked into this neighborhood called 5 Points. Have you heard of this neighborhood 5 Points? Have you all seen the movie Gangs of New York? Can you admit that here? Is that all right? Okay. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, you know what the neighborhood was like. 5 Points was known for its crime, and its poverty, and its prostitution, and its gang violence. Charles said that when he walked in there, his heart just melted, because what he saw in front of him were literally hundreds of children living in these incredibly unhealthy, dangerous environments. And he said that his mind raced back to what his pastor had said those years before, and he realized, in light of all that God had done for him when he was living in a broken place, he had some level of responsibility to do something with what he was seeing. He had to do something with what he saw in front of him, and so he did. He rallied actually some of his buddies together at the ripe old age of 27 years old, and he started what they called the Children's Aid Society. And the Children's Aid Society started all these programs that would deal like at a systemic level with what they were seeing in front of them in 5 Points. And so they started all kinds of programs that today seem so normal and important, but at the time were absolutely revolutionary. So for example, they started the first free school lunch programs. They started the first free dental clinics for kids. They started schools for children who were disabled. They started the first Parent-Teachers Association. PTA came from these guys. Most notably, though, they started what we now call foster care. So they would help these kids who were living in these unhealthy, dangerous environments find loving, stable homes while their parents did what they needed to do to create healthy environments for the kids once again, and then their families were reunified once more. What morphed and evolved from there became what we now call foster care. So friends, follow me. Foster care was started by a pastor. It was started by a Christian who understood that in light of the way that God met us in our brokenness, surely we could do the same for those around us. How cool is that? That's our legacy as a church. That's our legacy as God's people. I'm so stoked to be here today with you, Canvas, to be able to share with you that we have the opportunity to carry on that same torch today. We have the opportunity to carry on that same legacy. A few years ago, I was pastoring a church in South San Jose. That's where my family and I came out from today, was San Jose. And a small church, about 100 people on a Sunday. And my wife and I had recently become foster parents. We've been fostering now for 4+ years. And these kids were coming into our home. If you're not familiar with foster care, a kid or kids are removed from their families because of some kind of trauma, generally because of abuse or neglect. And it's no longer safe or appropriate for them to be living in their family. And so for a season, they're removed from their homes. And so we just had these kids starting to coming into our homes. Kids, honestly, who have been through stuff that nobody should go through, especially children. And our hearts just broke for these kids. And we started to think, maybe there's more that we could do than just opening up our own home. What if we were to leverage the platform that God had given us and actually invite our church to get engaged with us? We said, what if we were laser focused as a church? What if we were to engage what I believe was the most vulnerable population in the Bay Area? And so we came up with these ideas of things that we were going to do. What if we came up with some events that we were going to do to bless foster parents? What if we were to come up with some donations for kids entering into care? What if in a year, this is our big dream. This is our big one. We said, what if in a year we saw one more family opening up their own home? That's a big goal. That's a big vision. Because foster care is not like you're asking somebody to give $30 a month to like a kid across the world. It's a life-changing, world-altering decision. So we thought maybe over this next year, maybe there'd be one more family. Now, when you pastor a small church, you know everybody, right? So I'm like, even as we cast that vision for that one more family, I'm thinking, nobody's going to do this. We're not going to hit this one. So I'm like, you won't do it. You won't do it. In my mind, that's what I'm thinking. Nobody's going to do this, but we still put it out there. Can I tell you what happened? When we cast that vision, we invited a social worker to come out and join us, somebody that could speak on behalf of the foster care system. And she came up and she shared, and she stood in the back of the room the rest of the time we had this conversation. And she was kind of moved by our little church that wanted to do something. So she went back to her county buildings that following week, and she just started telling other social workers, man, you got to hear what I just did this last weekend. And so they came out and met with us, and they said, hey, we just want you to know, we think it's cool that you guys want to do this, and we're happy to partner with you in this. And they said, but could we be really honest with you? They said, the reality is that the crisis in foster care system, it's bigger than your church. And she said, do you think that there might be other churches that might want to do the very same thing? She said, would you guys consider, and this is the term she used, would you guys consider spearheading a faith alliance? And I said, well, what does that mean? I said, can you tell me what you mean by that? And she said, honestly, well, we've got events going on, and we've got donations coming in. She said, what we need are homes. She said, there are far more kids entering into foster care today than there are homes that are ready to care for them. And that's not just true in San Jose. It's true across the Bay Area. In fact, it's more true here in San Francisco than any other place in the Bay Area. Last year, 62% of kids that entered into foster care in the city had to be sent out of the city to find a loving home. 3 out of 5 kids. She said, would you guys help us to find homes for these kids? You have to understand that when kids enter into foster care, we can't find homes for them, and we have to send them to other parts of California. It adds trauma upon trauma upon trauma. Because now not only are they having to be removed from their biological families, but they're taken from their schools and their counselors and teachers and therapists and friends and extended family. It makes keeping them connected to their biological families and communities incredibly difficult. It adds trauma on trauma. And so I told her, and we've had many conversations with social workers after this. We said, gosh, the truest part of who I am is I'm a follower of Jesus. And at least part of what that means is that we try to take seriously what his commands are to us. And one of his most fundamental commands to us is to love our neighbor. And it broke my heart when I hear that somebody else, these are kids from my streets, from my neighborhoods. It broke my heart that there are people in other parts of California having to love my neighbor. There just seems like something fundamentally broken about that. So long story short, we said yes, and that's what Foster the Bay is. It's simply this faith alliance. These social workers said, hey, what if the church were to rally together to help us make sure that every one of these vulnerable kids can experience the love that they deserve? And so it's been unbelievable over the last 3 years. We launched just over 3 years ago, and being able to partner with churches like Canvas, it's been unbelievable to see what the Bay Area Church is doing and how they're responding. Over the last 3 years, more than 75 churches have already responded to the call and come together in this what they call as a faith alliance. And they're saying, hey, we're not going to stand idly by while there's kids, vulnerable kids in need. And again, it's really neat, especially in San Francisco. And can I tell you, I think God is at work here. I'll tell you one more story. This isn't in my notes, and I have to be quick because of time. But when we were about to launch here in San Francisco and starting to work with churches here in the city, we were asked to meet with an organization called Safe and Sound. And Safe and Sound, if you're not familiar with them, they're contracted by the city of San Francisco to work specifically with kids who are in foster care that have been trafficked, that have been sexually exploited. And so she said, Philip, she said, I have 69 open cases of children in the city who have been trafficked. I asked her, I said, how many of those kids have you been able to find a home for? And she said, 12. 12 of the 69 kids. And it broke my heart because for so long as a church in the Bay Area, we have talked so passionately about how much we care about the issue of human trafficking. And here are 57 kids in our city that we can't find homes for. She said, Philip, at the very end of our meeting, she said, "Can I tell you one more thing before we go?" She said she was a follower of Jesus, and she said, "Can I tell you one more thing before we go?" She said, "But I don't want you to think that I'm too Pentecostal." And I said, "Okay, go for it." And so she said, recently, she said, I had this dream, and she said, in my dream, she said there was this house in front of me, this multi-level house, and she said it was on fire, and she said, the kids that I worked with were in this house as it was burning down, and she said they were in the upper story, and they were jumping out of this upper story window to the ground. She said, you have to understand that the kids that I work with, their suicidal tendencies are really high. In fact, just for the foster youth, the suicidal tendencies are 4 times higher than that of the average youth. It's even more so for those who have gone through what these kids have gone through. So she said these kids were in the upper story, and they were jumping out of this window. And she said, I was on the ground trying to catch them before they hit the ground The problem was, she said, is that there were too many kids and I couldn't catch them all. So she said that in my dream, in my sense of desperation, I turned around and I looked, and there was this whole crowd of people running up behind me, and they started catching the kids with me. She said, just after I had this dream, I heard about Foster the Bay and heard about this alliance of churches. She said, the reason I reached out to you to meet with you today is because I think that crowd in my dream are the churches of San Francisco. That's what Foster the Bay is about. That's what you're being invited into today. There are kids that desperately need to be caught. That's your invitation. When we launched Foster the Bay a few years ago, we launched with some 3 core beliefs. 3 things that were going to be like the foundation and the pillars that are going to shape who we were and what we did. 3 beliefs. And I want to share these 3 with you with the time that I have left. And here's the deal. I know that foster care is not for every person in this room. We get that. Okay, foster care is but one expression of remarkable compassion. The thing is, if you're a follower of Jesus, you are called into a life of remarkable compassion. That's not up for debate. That's biblical. That's following Jesus as an example. Foster care is one expression of that. But here's the deal. These 3 core beliefs I'm going to share with you here in just a minute, regardless of what expression God might be calling you into, I believe that these 3 core beliefs can help shape and push you forward, propel you forward, compel you forward. Okay, so even if foster care is not even on your radar, stay with me. All right, here's the first one. Here's the first core belief that really shapes who we are and what we did. And it's this belief that every person has intrinsic value. Every person in the Bay Area, man, woman, and child, is valuable to God. You believe that? In the book of Genesis, it says that we were created in the image of the God of the universe. In Ephesians chapter 1, it says that we were spoken forth from before the foundation of the world. Think about that for a moment. We were spoken forth from before the world began. You know what that means? That means that physical act between your mom and your dad that put you into being, we'll just leave it at that because it's disgusting and my son's right over there, right? All right, that moment of conception, that was secondary. What came first was that you were birthed in the heart of God. You were spoken forth from before the foundation of the world. The book of Isaiah goes on to say we are precious to God in his sight. You're valuable to God. And so is every man, woman, and child in the Bay Area. I have a buddy who's a foster dad. He said that he got a call for a kid who needed to be placed in a home. And he already had kids in the house at the time. So when he was on the phone, he said, well, before I say yes to this child, can you tell me a little bit more about him? Can you, what can you tell me? And they said, well, we don't know much about him. He's brand new to the system. They said, we do know that he's a biter, though. So my buddy's like, well, what does that mean? Like what does he bite? And he thought to himself, he's like, I'm not sure if I want to take in a biter. He said, though, as soon as that thought hit him, all of his theology started flooding back into his mind. And he realized, he said, that the term biter is an inadequate description of a child. It's an incomplete description of a human being. You know why? Because you are more than the worst thing you've ever done. And you're more than the worst thing that's ever been done to you. Which, by the way, you might need to be here in this room today. You might have fought through all those beta breakers traffic just so you could hear that one single statement. Someone's going to say it one more time. You are more than the worst thing you've ever done. And you're more than the worst thing that's ever been done to you. You matter to God. You are valuable to God. And he proved that, didn't he? How do you determine the value of something? You determine the value of something by what someone's willing to pay for it, right? And what was God willing to pay for you? Everything. Absolutely everything. God proves his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You're valuable to God. And so is every vulnerable child across the Bay Area. And that brings me to our second core belief, and that's this. Our second core belief is this, that their story is our story. Their story that's my story. I may be a little bit biased here, but there may be no time in your life when you are more like God than in the moments when you open up your heart or your home to someone who's in need. When you open up your family to someone who's in need. You know why? That's what he did for us. That's what he did for me. There was a time in my life when I was lost and beat up and broken and hurting. And I thought that because of all of the wounds and the scars from my past, that I had absolutely no hope for my future. Has anybody else been there? But when I was at my lowest and my darkest place, God showed up. And he brought me into his family. And he gave me a hope for my future. Is that your story? When I think about all that God has done for me, like I get so excited that maybe, just maybe, I can do that for someone else. It makes me want to do that for someone else, doesn't it? There's a verse in Ephesians 1. It says this. It says, God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. I love that. Think about that. I love that it says he decided in advance. Like, this wasn't plan B or plan C. Like, my mistakes, like, threw him off course, and he's got to, like, bring in the ambulance and, try to, come up with that plan B, plan C. No, it's plan A. God decided in advance to adopt us. Which, by the way, you might be here today and you're just here exploring. You're just wondering what this whole Christianity thing is about, this whole Jesus thing is about. And you're even thinking, man, if there is a God out there, would he even want something to do with somebody like me? After all the places I've been and all the things that I've done, could he even want someone like me? Look at the verse. To bring you into his family would bring him great joy, great pleasure. I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I question that. Sometimes I wonder if God is disappointed with the fact that he made that invitation to me. I've just made too many mistakes over and over and over again, and God is perpetually disappointed in me. Has anybody else been there? Like God's begrudgingly letting you into his family. He decided in advance to do it. It's what he wanted to do, and it gives him pleasure to have you in his family. I get this on like a minuscule level as a foster dad, because we get the joy now of bringing little ones into our home. We've got one of our kids that's with us today is actually we've been fostering, and I'm gonna let you guess which one when you're with our family. Like, which one doesn't belong? They all belong. You know what I mean. This isn't being recorded, right? You know what I mean. But listen, this little girl, say I've already cut it in half now, 50%. Now you're going to have to pick between two. She brings us so much joy. She's brought so much laughter into our home. We have made she's young, and so she's learning to speak, and so she's at that age where she's saying all kinds of stuff, and some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't. She's brought so much joy into our home. And when she comes in the morning and she comes and runs and gives me a hug, or when I come home from work and she comes running to the door, like, I cannot begin to tell you the amount of joy that brings. And when I just that the thought that God might look at me the way that I look at her, how cool is that? It would bring him great pleasure. But listen, God bringing us into his family not only brings him great joy and great pleasure, it also brings what? It also came with sacrifice. It came with great sacrifice. And in the same way that you and I show remarkable compassion, in the same way that you and I receive joy from showing compassion and inviting others into our hearts and into our homes, in the same way, when you and I show remarkable compassion, there will always, 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 always be a cost involved. It will always come with sacrifice. When people hear that we're foster parents, this is what we typically get from a response. Like, oh man, that's awesome. That's amazing. That's so cool that you guys do that. I could never do that. I could never do that. And they say stuff like, well, isn't that hard? Like, kids who've experienced that kind of like trauma, like, don't they sometimes come in with some like maybe behavioral challenges or something? And the answer is, yeah, they do sometimes. Or they say like, isn't it hard like for you to kind of expose yourself and like fall in love with these kids, and then they're with you for months or a year or 2 years? They become like a part of your family, become like a son or a daughter to you, and then all of a sudden you get a phone call and they get picked up and then brought back to their family and you never see them again. Isn't that difficult for you? Can I tell you what's going through my head when people ask me that? Like, of course it is. Of course it's hard, right? I'm not some cold-hearted robot. Of course it's hard to fall in love with them and then maybe to never see them again. Feels like the death of a child. The first little one that we brought into our home, she was 4 months old. We had her for a year. Beautiful little girl. She became like a daughter to us, like a sister to my kids. Because of the age we had her, she took her first steps into my living room. She said her first words with us. She called me Dada. It's her first word. She called my wife Mama because that's what she heard other kids calling us. She was a sister to my kids. Throughout that year, we did fall in love with her. But throughout that year, we were also getting to know her biological parents. And the reality is that their daughter was with us for a reason. Like, they'd made some mistakes. But over that year, they were doing everything they possibly could to get their little girl back. Taking every right step. And so after about a year or so, the judge gave the green light and he said, okay, it's time. And so I remember like it was yesterday. I remember handing this little girl back into the arms of her father at my front door. My son over here told me it was the first time he'd ever seen me cry. Because we wept that day. Of course it hurts. It still hurts. But you don't show compassion because it makes you feel good, right? Compassion's not about you. I have a friend who says you don't foster to get a child for your family. You foster to give your family to a child. You see the difference? And that's true with every expression of compassion. You don't show compassion to get something for yourself. You show compassion to give yourself to something. But if we are willing to embrace both the pain and the sacrifice and the pleasure and the joy, it's amazing to think about the impact that we might have. That brings you to my final core belief, and that's this. That our investment in the lives of the vulnerable could potentially bring long-term impact. Let me break that down. Okay, so even if foster care is completely off your radar, I bet you can guess that kids who grow up without a stable, healthy environment, they're far more susceptible to all kinds of issues as they get older. So let me give you a few examples. So the FBI did a study a few years ago that said that 60% of children who are rescued from human trafficking domestically here in the States came from foster care. 60%. Half of kids who age out of foster care, if they're not placed into a loving, stable home, half of kids will be unemployed in their mid-20s, a third will be on the streets, half will have a substance addiction, okay? More than half will have PTSD. In fact, you're more likely to have PTSD as a foster child than as a war veteran because of all that you go through. Okay, so what we began to realize was like, all right, we need churches and individuals and organizations to be addressing these kinds of things like homelessness and trafficking and unemployment and all this. Like we need groups in the Tenderloin today addressing these things while people are smack dab in the middle of it. We need people down at St. James Park in my neck of the woods helping people get the showers and the job training and all the rest of it. Like we need people right when they're in the thing. We need groups like IJM that are kicking down doors and rescuing boys and girls who are being trafficked today. But what if in addition to that, we also go all the way upstream and we care for the kids before they ever enter into these issues? What would the statistics in the Bay Area look like in 15 years if every child today that entered into foster care was immediately placed into a loving home? We realize that the best way to see a transformed Bay Area tomorrow is if we care for vulnerable children today. That's not just a catchy little mantra. That's true. And I believe that some of you here today are being called to be a part of that. I'm going to share a couple of key ways that you could take a next step and actually join what Foster the Bay is doing and be a part of this. But first, I want to invite you to watch just a quick video with me, my friend Josh.
Statistically, I'm supposed to be dead, in jail, or homeless. You see, as a foster kid, my odds were already pretty bleak. About 30% of foster kids end up homeless. Less than 3% will go on to earn a college degree, and only about half will be gainfully employed by the time they turn 24. Yet, here I am. Why? All because of Rodney. Let me tell you about Rodney. You see, I spent 3 years trying to get kicked out of Rodney's foster home, and I'll be honest, I did everything I could think of, and I am a fairly creative guy. My most notable stunt was I opened up a checking account, and then I proceeded to write $10,000 worth of bad checks. I actually got picked up by the police for that little brilliant stunt. But what Rodney did was interesting. I remember after allowing me to spend the night in jail, he bailed me out the next morning, and I thought for sure that was going to be it, that this guy was going to give up on me. But Rodney sat me down and he said, Josh, you know, you can keep causing problems, but you've got to realize, son, we don't see you as a problem. We actually see you as an opportunity. You see, Rodney didn't see what was on the surface, right? This kid who was being a nuisance, this kid who was a troublemaker, or some might even say a lost cause. He saw what I could be. And that moment was my turning point. My turning point from being an inevitable statistic to who I am today. All because of one caring adult. You see, every kid is one caring adult away from being a success story. So let me be frank with you. You, watching this video right now, you could be the very reason one of these kids doesn't end up a statistic. Foster the Bay is focused on providing a loving home for every single kid in the foster care system. Now, they do this in two ways. Number one, by recruiting foster parents. Maybe that's something you're interested in. And they do this secondly, by recruiting individuals to support these foster parents. Maybe that's something you're interested in. You see, these support teams, they come alongside the foster families as they care for these kids. Because of Rodney, my life was genuinely, drastically, forever changed. And with Foster the Bay's model, all of us can be a Rodney, either as a foster parent or as a member of that support team for the foster parents. Either way you look at it, you could be that Rodney. You could be that one caring adult in a kid's life that forever changes his life. To learn more, check out fosterthebay.org/get-involved.
As Josh said, there are multiple ways for you to get involved, and I do hope that you might be open to whether or not God might be stirring in you to just maybe even to just take the next step to learn a little bit more. For 1, 2, 3 of you, that might actually mean opening up your home to a child in need. Our prayer is that every church that we partner with, that we see at least one foster family with a team of 4 support friends. For some churches, that's going to be more, 2, 3, 4 families. But we believe that that's a great goal for every church, is to see one more family. And the fact is, there were about 2,000 kids that entered into foster care last year in the Bay Area, across the 10 counties of the Bay Area. About half of those kids were sent out of their home county to other parts of California or other parts of the U.S. because of a lack of homes. About 1,000. There are over 4,000 Christ-centered Bible-teaching churches in the Bay Area. If even a fraction of Bay Area churches raise up at least one foster family with a team of 4 support friends, we'll have more than enough to meet the need. So my hope is that there might be 1, 2, 3 families right here that are willing to at least explore that. But that's not for everybody. Okay, so take a breath. Okay, that's not for all of you. But the fact is, as Josh said, there are other ways to get involved. One of the reasons why there's such a shortage of foster homes is because it's really hard. It's really, really hard. In fact, across the country, about 50% of foster families won't make it past their first year by the second year, about 80% have dropped out. Do you know what changes that retention? Do you know what enables a parent to foster longer and better? If they have community around them. If they have people that will come alongside them and will help kind of bear that weight with them. They'll come and drop off meals once or twice a month or babysit once or twice a month. My wife and I, we're foster parents through Foster Bay. We have a support friend team. My wife and I get date nights. So there's been some incredibly difficult seasons of our 4-year journey through foster care, where there's some chaos and some turmoil. My wife and I were able to get away and be able to protect and make our marriage thrive. We were able to laugh together, cry together, talk together, because we had people that came over that stepped into the battle with us and helped bear the weight. We bear each other's burdens and we share each other's joys. So God might be calling some of you to step in and become a support friend. You care just as much about these vulnerable kids, but maybe you're not in a season where you can open up your own homes. You can come and support someone who can. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a foster parent or a support friend, I want to encourage you to go back to the table in the back. My friend G is there, and I'll be back there as well. And we would love to be able to chat with you and be able to help you take that next step. And you're just going to fill out a next step card. Okay? And as you fill out this next step card, just let us know what time you'd like us to drop your foster kid off to your house tomorrow. I'm kidding. If you fill out this card, all we're going to do is we're going to send you an email this week, okay? We're going to send you an email, and we're going to let you know about an interest meeting that's coming up here in the city where you can learn a little bit more and you can ask some questions, okay? In fact, Canvas is hosting an interest meeting that's available for our partner churches across the city, across the Bay Area on May 29th. But even if that date doesn't work for you, we've got other meetings all across the Bay Area happening all the time. Fill out this next step card, and we're going to send you some more information, okay? Let me close with this. I'm already a minute over my time. Foster care is not for everybody. I've said that before. Remarkable compassion is. So I began our time by telling you what the word compassion meant. Let me end this by telling you what the word remarkable means. Remarkable means you're able to remark on it. That's what remarkable means. You're able to, in other words, it's worth talking about. If you're a follower of Jesus today, God is calling you into a life of compassion that's worth talking about. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, let your light shine before others so they might see your good deeds and glorify your Father who's in heaven. In other words, are you living a life of compassion that just when people look at your life, they have to respond in some way? That's what God is calling us into, a beautiful, joy-filled, oftentimes pain-filled life of remarkable compassion. That's what you were meant for. I want to invite you to join us. That's what God is calling me into more and more. It's what God is calling you into more and more. Let's do that together.